Welcome to EMA 620, Education Policy Studies. My name is Dr. Perpetua Kalimasi, your instructor for this course. Before we begin, let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered how education decisions are made in Tanzania? How do they impact students and the future of teaching and learning? Today, we'll do a recap on education policy studies, just to assess ourselves where we are in line with the prescribed learning outcomes. Just to remind ourselves, the following were our learning outcomes at the end of this course. The first one was to understand and apply varied policy models used in education policy processes. Second, to analyze education-based policies and its link to education system. Third, to critically review the existing policies and developing new ones. The last one was for you to be able to develop education-based guidelines in your future career. Before we begin, here are the important concepts in education policy studies that guide the competencies expected in this course. These concepts will also guide the reflection of our recap today. Now let's dive in. There are various concepts which are very important, as I've said, for reflecting the competencies for education policy studies. The first one is the concept of policy itself. And when we're talking about policy itself, at our level, we are talking not only for the memorization or the definitions, but we are going beyond by talking even the layout of various policy documents. For example, how many chapters, the write-up, the language that is used, etc. And we're also talking about in our context, because various decisions that are given, they are given by the government. That's why we're talking about public policy. We're also talking about educational policy for our very context of education. Another concept is policy studies, which means the studies of contents of policy, study of outputs, the study of impacts of various education policies, etc. We are also talking about various policy statements. And as I've said, from the concept of policy, with policy statements, we are also talking about different kinds of statements, the way we can critically review various statements to check their coherence, their consistencies, etc. Some other important concepts include policy instruments, policy performance, policy results. For example, when we are talking about the free education that we have, we can see the results of increasing enrollment of students in our classrooms. We can see the results of increasing classrooms, laboratories, and other many results. We are also talking about educational policy research, which is a very important concept, because in the science of education policy making processes, we are talking about evidence-based policy making, whereby we should think about developing our policies based on research. We're also talking about policy inducements. An example of it, you remember we discussed during our sessions, an example of it includes the capitation grants that are given by the government to support our secondary and schools. We're also talking about the link between politics versus policy, and the link between policy and law is we all understand that some policy statements or directives requires legal interventions for them to be effectively implemented. And another very important concept relevant for this recap is education policy actors. Remember, we mentioned a lot of actors, and it is a call upon you to continue thinking and reflecting more and more actors. You mentioned about teachers, NGOs like Hakelim, Twaweza, media, yeah, politicians, parents, education leaders, etc. So try to think of as many actors as possible in your independent studies and for further reading. So what is your personal reflection in these important concepts? You can think about these concepts. You may continue to go through various readings to understand the meaning and the application of examples, real examples in your education context about these concepts. And apart from the concepts, there are more modules in this course, which among them is the historical development of education policies in Tanzania, because one of the very important skills for policy analysts, and especially in education policy, is the understanding of these policy analysts, his or her understanding on the history of education in Tanzania, so that it can be easy for him or her to link the policies, plans, strategies, acts, ordinances, committees, campaigns that we had in our historical times, and the impact of those to the current structure or system of education. So we can try to remember we discussed about this history of education from the pre-colonial times, and we went further to the kinds of education policies during the colonial times. You remember the Education Ordinance of 1927, the Education Acts. You remember the examples of education policies during independence in 1961 to 67, the very known socialism and education for self-reliance policy, which laid a very good foundation for our education system in Tanzania, and we still apply a lot of the skills and attitudes of this kind of policies until to date. And another further development include the post-independence reforms, where we had during the 1967 to 78, where we had the universal private education programs, the Musoma resolutions, and plus all the assumptions that guided these policies. We also had the 1980s to 1990s, the Makweta commissions, etc. You can try to go through various readings to remind yourself about this development in these years. We also had the 1990 to 2000, where we had a major review of education system to suit the needs of this period. And from the 2000 to first of all, the 1990s, the time from 1990s to 2000, we had a lot of policies there in between. We had our first known policy of 1995, the education and training policy. We had the 1996 technical and vocational education policy. We had the higher education policy of 1999. And then from the 2000 is where we had now the unemployment among graduates, and there we had different policies developed by different universities. For example, the University of Dar es Salaam developed the entrepreneurship policy, trying to cater for entrepreneurship development to trying to address unemployment among graduates. And then we had a very new policy of 2014, which is now we have Vision 2023 that you have witnessed just a few days ago, that it has been inaugurated by the President of the United Republic of Tanzania just a few days ago. So this marks the kind of development of education policy processes in Tanzania to date. And apart from that historical development, You can try to go through the history, or you can try to retrieve your knowledge of education history. You can learn a lot of acts and ordinances that have been taken through since the pre-colonial era to date. And apart from that, we also have the international development and declarations related to digital education. We understand the role of digitalization that has taken place from the primary level to the university level. We are talking about e-learning systems. We are talking about various different learning management systems. We are talking about various digital learning tools. We are talking about digital teaching that is more emphasized to teachers almost in all levels. We are talking about issues on inclusive education, where students with different abilities are supposed to be accommodated in normal classrooms so that they can get equal chance to learn. We have issues recently of artificial intelligence. We have Sustainable Development Goals, especially Sustainable Development number 4 on quality education, and many other recent developments in education. So all these aforementioned acts, declarations, and policies of socio-economic and political times in Tanzania had objectives which were relevant to the specific times. They also had the strengths and weaknesses, which are essentially part and parcel of what we are experiencing today in our education system. As part of the review questions for reflections, can you please consider some of these questions? What role can education history play in shaping education system? Why do education policies vary over countries? We always hear about the Finnish education system and the way different countries are trying to learn from the Finnish education system and other countries. What is the impact of colonial education policies in Tanzania to our current policies? To what extent are we prepared with the recent development in education? For example, visual realities, artificial intelligence, etc. So these are some of the review questions that we can try to reflect as we are doing this recap. Now, take time to explore these questions. Welcome back. Having reflected on the development of education policy in Tanzania, now let's proceed on another important content on education policy approaches. In literature, some of these approaches are called traditional and some modern approaches. The most important thing to remember is that these approaches informs education policy processes. So it is better that we understand them as they are in literature in the way they can inform education policy processes. And when you try to compare between traditional and modern approaches, you can see more or less similar processes or stages or procedures. For example, in the traditional approach, there's the policy determination, policy development, policy approval, policy implementation, and evaluation. While on the modern approach, there's the agenda setting, policy formulation, policy adoption, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. So these approaches are more or less the same, and they inform the education policy processes. And when we're talking about these processes, for example, in the first stage or first process in the modern or traditional approach, we are talking about the integrated processes, combination of integrated processes. For example, problem identification, generation of policy options. And when we're generating policy options, it means we are trying to think about the goals of the specific policy. We are thinking about objectives. We are thinking about policy issues. We're thinking about the way policy statements are formulated. You remember you presented in the first session, you presented we had an assignment of trying to read and review and present various policy statements and see their coherence, etc. So those are the statements. And then the third process becomes the evaluation of those options. When you have the statements, your role is to check, to evaluate those statements, to check the coherence and other issues. And then followed by policy adoption, planning of policy implementation, evaluation, and then subsequent policy cycles begin. And you can see the cyclic nature of the education policy making processes. And apart from the role that the approaches is playing to inform the policy making processes, we should also reflect the education policy models, just the way we discussed during our session. This is just the summary of the models. I remember we had a very fruitful discussion on these models. So just in summary, we had synoptic model, institutional model, process model, rational model, incremental model, garbage can model, political model, systems model, plural model, a light model, etc. This is how they are in different literature, and you don't need to be confused. There are different names in different models. What is important for you to understand is just to make sure that you understand the model itself, for example, the process model. Why is it called the process model, and what is important? What is the importance of the process model, for instance, in our understanding, general understanding of our education policy process? What is the role of incremental model? We understand most of our policies are developed through adding a small incremental changes in the policies to reflect various issues which are happening in our societies. And what is most important to understand is that these different models, they provide insights on how policies are formulated, or the way they are implemented, or they are evaluated. So it is important to understand that when you review different education-based policies, you can see some inputs, some issues, almost from all the models. You can see some of the attributes from almost all the models to the way our education policy making processes are taking place in Tanzania. Did you notice any connection between the approaches, models, and education policy processes? Think about it for a few seconds. Then, as a policy analyst or policy reviewer or policy maker or practitioner, it is important that we think about constraining factors in education policy processes. And this includes resource availability. You mentioned more than this. This is just the way to summarize these factors. You mentioned more than this, but we have resource availability, political ideologies, organizational and technical constraints, legal constraints. Sometimes you have some policy options with directives and statements, but when you cross-check the legal issues, you can find that there are no legal directives to enforce the implementation of a certain policy option. Mismatch between goals and feasibility of its implementation. Because you are experienced teachers and practitioners, I'm sure you have seen a lot of some policy goals or directives whose visibility becomes very difficult due to the environment, or due to resources, or due to socioeconomic and political environment, etc. Another constraining factor is the inadequate baseline data for evaluation, because in most cases we develop some policies out of not enough baseline data to inform our evaluation at the end. Now make your own reflection about the learning outcomes. Can you critically review the existing policies? Can you develop new guidelines? Because I'm sure at this point, at any time you can be involved in the development of a certain policy or a certain guideline or a certain strategy. So try to reflect yourself. Can you do that? based on what we have been discussing, based on the assessment, based on the discussions that we've been doing, based on the assignments that we've been doing, etc. In finalizing our reflections, there are some necessary competencies which are important for you as an educational policy analyst. Which competencies do you think are necessary for you? Here are just some of them. You can think about more than this in your own discussion and your own further readings. The first one is that it is important for you to have the skill to develop relevant indicators to allow effective evaluations. As I've said, in some cases we don't have relevant or enough baseline data, but this data have to be collected. You should also have the skill to kind of emotional intelligence, to pay attention to political aspects of decision making, because as you remember, the link between politics and policy. You should also have the skill or the knowledge or to have relevant information about the policy. For example, its history. For example, if we understand where we came from, for example, from the pre-colonial era, through the Education for Self-Reliance, through the Education Training Policy of 1995, through the universal primary education, through the promotion of higher education, and now it is easy for you to reflect or understand or implement or suggest or evaluate the current education and training policy for better. Another very important skill includes the problem-solving skills, assessment skills, management skills, communication skills, team building, and research skills. As we are saying that these days we are promoting evidence-based policy making processes. Another very important skill is the skill to communicate results of analysis to policymakers. As you understand and we discussed during our sessions that there is always a gap between policymakers and researchers. Policymakers are saying some of the complaint to the researchers that sometimes they come with impractical solutions, or they are coming with some policy implications which cannot be implemented. And researchers are also complaining that policymakers they are doing a lot of research, but it is not consumed by policymakers. So this kind of gap needs skills for researchers to communicate effectively results of their analysis so that they can be consumed by policymakers. Writing skills, public speaking, advocacy skills, etc. Remember, in the agenda setting, there's a lot of lobbying which is needed for your agenda to be set forth, to be accepted by the practitioners, so that it can be stressed and be opted over other issues. In summary, educational policies are the backbone of effective learning systems. They determine what is taught, how something can be taught, and who benefits from the education. So when crafted and implemented well, evidence-based education policies can transform societies by ensuring high quality education for all. Now think about this. How do educational policies in Tanzania affect you or those around you? What changes would you like to see? Would love to hear your thoughts on e-learning. Share your comments and join the conversation on shaping the future of education in discussion forum. And it is my expectation that at the end of this recap, you can see where you are yourself as far as the learning outcomes of this course is concerned. And I'm sure you have learned a lot of things in this course which can also be relevant to your career and can also be useful to also other courses. Until next time, Keep learning and keep growing. Thank you.